The field of entertainment is filled with people who are sometimes called auteurs, people whose strong vision clearly comes through in basically every piece of entertainment they create. Some people get to chase this vision with a higher budget, some with a smaller one, and most of them end up being lost in the currents of time. One of the people I might call an auteur is Kenji Eno, whose company made only a few games, but many of them became kinda cult classics, and today I'm gonna talk through my experience of playing through 2 of them. D is a horror-themed adventure game released in 1995, and as of the date of writing this, it's available for purchase on GOG. However, that's not the version I ended up playing, since as I started up the game I noticed the introductory FMV sequences were horribly compressed. This wasn't helped much even by updating the DOSBox and going through forum posts detailing appropriate settings to use for D. Admittedly, for such an old game I didn't expect exceptionally great video compression, but even for the time the PC version's videos are pretty horrendous in quality. So I chose to go another way and play the original version of D, released on the 3DO, now thankfully playable on modern hardware through RetroArch, and lo and behold, this was a very good decision. D begins with an introduction set in Los Angeles in the year 1997. The overlaid text explains there's been a mass murder committed by someone called Richter Harris, as the video shows us scenes of the victims and the perpetrator. Harris is a renowned doctor and the director of the hospital who seemed to suddenly change, committing this heinous crime. Currently he's holed up in the hospital with several hostages. His daughter Laura hears of this and speeds to the scene, wanting to know why her father would do something like this, so she somehow manages to slip past the police surrounding the scene, arriving at the hospital. This leads to the main menu, which isn't really much of a menu. Instead, it's merely a background image with the logo of the game on top of it. And once you press start, the game transitions to another cutscene where we see Laura enter the hospital and witness some of his father's victims, which visibly shocks her. Then something strange happens and everything around her changes. She's no longer inside of the reception area of the hospital, but instead inside what looks like a medieval European castle. This then leads to a pretty smooth transition into gameplay, which was so smooth I initially just thought that the game had bugged out and frozen. The gameplay of D is very reminiscent of first-person adventure games like Myst, where you're locked in place and can use the controls to either turn around to look at another predetermined location or move towards where you're looking at. Each of these actions is accompanied by pre-rendered videos showing the action you're taking, still from the first-person perspective. In addition to looking around and moving through available hotspots, there are 2 buttons that can be used to interact with the world. First of these is the action button, which can initially be used to examine a world object, such as a bowl on a dinner table in this room, which shows even more of the clearly supernatural nature of the world you've been thrust into, as the water in the bowl turns into blood. This cutscene also shows that while in regular gameplay the world is shown exclusively from a first-person perspective, these kinds of cutscenes where you interact with the world can be shown from the third person, where you can see the reactions of Laura. The other action button opens your inventory, where currently you only have a compact and a pocket watch, which shows that the game seems to begin at 3 AM. The compact, on the other hand, is an interesting item and pushes the game even more into the clearly supernatural, as by using the compact from the inventory you're shown a cutscene where the compact begins to glow as Laura peers into it, after which you're shown an image of something in the game, before the mirror slightly cracks. In essence, the compact is a hint item with limited uses that can be activated to give a simple hint on something you need to pay attention to progress further. And I like how it's been integrated into the world of the game. As you begin exploring the castle, you're soon stopped by another cutscene, where a disembodied voice calls out for Laura, multiple times.
Laura. 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 This is your father.
Laura's father seems to be contacting her telepathically, explaining that this world is inside his mind, and if you do not leave you might be trapped in here forever. However, he doesn't seem to be able to finish whatever he's saying, as the apparition disappears mid-sentence. Exploring thoroughly, it's possible to find a strange little bug that triggers some kind of a vision, where Laura sees a woman wearing a necklace of a somewhat similar shape as the bug, sitting at a dinner table, until something seems to happen which frightens this woman. This vision is accompanied by unsettling music and quick flashes of someone's D. One thing D does really well from the very beginning is set the tone. While the intro might imply a relatively standard murder mystery plot, that assumption is quickly shattered as you get into the game, and the world around you morphs into this medieval castle. Similarly, beginning with the first room, many things strange and surreal happen, clearly showing that this is not going to be just a regular romp through reality as we know it. D also does a pretty nice fake-out very early on if you attempt to explore a wine cellar of sorts, where trying to move into a clearly visible room at the back of it starts another cutscene, where metal spikes extrude from the rear wall and the world quickly begins to move towards Laura. Someone familiar with the 80s and 90s adventure games might assume that this is the first death scenario, but instead it's not, and you're shown how Laura's barely managed to avoid certain death. While this might alleviate some of the fears the player might have about the threat level of the game, the overall atmosphere is still very unsettling, not only because the layout of the castle seems somewhat strange, including a room where the only purpose seems to be to impale people, but also because of the very minimalistic but unsettling background ambiance. The audio design is pretty fantastic and, unsurprisingly, pretty standard for Japanese horror media in general, where unsettling atonal audio is common and actual musical cues are used sparingly to highlight specific moments. The initial area follows a very standard adventure game pattern. You're given clues very sparingly, and many of the things you see are more surreal in nature than directly helpful. The transitions from one view to another and the videos examining objects are relatively slow, all of which contributes to the somewhat claustrophobic atmosphere of D. There are a few objects you can properly interact with in a way where you're shown a video examining the object further, which in and of itself acts as a clue on things you might have to interact with later. These objects include more obvious things like locked doors and less obvious ones such as a barrel of wine. At the start, there are only a few rooms you can access, and a couple obvious roadblocks that impede your progress, showing that in the end, progression is likely to be very linear. From the upstairs fireplace, you can find a key. Having likely interacted with the locked door in the very first room of the game, it doesn't take much to figure out what you're intended to do. To actually unlock the door, the key needs to be selected from the inventory while in the specific view, after which another cutscene plays, showing Laura opening the door while one of their very few musical stingers plays. Up until this point, the exploration's been pretty straightforward. Some areas have been blocked, some areas just end, and the few rooms you've been able to access have given you very little to work on. Now you've run out of items to grab and instead have to figure out how to solve puzzles. This is also where a tradition of adventure gaming rears its head. One of the puzzles seems to be a timing-related one, where pulling a lever activates a rotating number display, and letting go of it stops the number a few steps ahead of where you let go. The second number works in a similar way, except it also scrolls forward an equal amount of steps as the number in the first slot is. However, there doesn't seem to be any clues on what numbers you're actually intended to get into these slots, and a brute force approach to a puzzle like this seems unlikely, which probably gets the player to assume there must be something else that has to be done first. And here is where the adventure tradition comes into play, as it's possible you've also found a blank piece of paper from the upstairs dresser by using the interaction view where the player could use a highlight cursor with the movement buttons to choose which of the number drawers to open. While the paper doesn't seem to have much significance at this point, it in fact ended up being the solution to being able to move forwards, since in a fit of slightly confusing logic, the paper needs to be submerged in the water, which then reveals a much more clear clue about what the players intended to do next. I'm never a huge fan of having the very first actual puzzle of an adventure game be a somewhat confusing one. Sure, since the area you're locked into is relatively small, it's not beyond probability that players would eventually just attempt to use the paper on the bowl of water anyway, but I'd like it if games would try to teach the player how to solve puzzles within, instead of relying on a use everything on everything approach, which is unfortunately a common first solution for many adventure gaming fans, when I believe it should be seen as a flaw of game design, not as a required feature of the genre. The next steps have been telegraphed better, and it's not particularly difficult to follow the clues to find yet another locked door, this time with a very prominent 2-number sequence painted on it. Using this newly found clue and the somewhat clunky controls, it's possible to solve the handle puzzle, receive a new item and use it to unlock the door on which you found the number from. These sequences also highlight one aspect which can be a negative for some players. Since I've mentioned, every transition and action plays a video detailing the action, and how these videos are relatively slow. This means that going from one area to another does take a while, and sometimes it's necessary to go to one area, then back to some other area, and then back to where you started, which might not be the most exciting thing to do. However, this does in fact have a clear purpose, which can come as a surprise. Laura's father's warnings are not for naught, and while it's impossible to just leave unless you count turning the game off as that, you do indeed lose the game if you spend too much time within it. In fact, there seems to be a 2-hour time limit on finishing the game, and as there is no save system, the player is forced to play through it in one sitting. If the player is to encounter this time limit, that shows one of the purposes of these slow animations. They're meant to make the player feel even more anxiety, as even if you do know how to get through a portion of the game, the timer is constantly ticking in the background, and there's nothing you can do to make Laura move faster. While it might not be particularly fun for all, and in fact might even be boring to some, I find it to be kinda brilliant in its own way. As you open the door and get to watch an Indiana Jones-inspired sequence of running from a very circular boulder, the linear nature of D is confirmed in a very clear way, since you now find yourself in a completely new area, and returning to where you came from is made impossible thanks to the boulder Laura escaped from in the cutscene. The second area continues the same gameplay loop from the first area. You're locked into a relatively small space and need to solve puzzles to move further. This time, however, many of the clues are in the environment itself, also continuing the somewhat surreal nature of your surroundings. One problem of this type of gameplay where you move between hotspots is highlighted in the second area, as to reach one of the necessary hotspots isn't as simple as it might seem, and instead the player has to unintuitively move further away from the desired location first, after which the view can be turned into the appropriate direction and the hotspot can then be examined. As you progress in the game, you're occasionally contacted by your increasingly more impatient father, who still implores you to leave while giving very little additional information. The second area is actually pretty short, and the puzzle's pretty simple and intuitive, so in some ways I think it would have been a better introduction to the gameplay, instead of having one of the more confusing puzzles of D, followed by a finicky timing puzzle, be that introduction. As is now routine, you've once more locked into a completely new area, and your pathway back has been sealed. The third area is in many ways the most tedious of them all, while in concept it is kind of interesting. You're in a round room with a mechanism on one side of it. Activating this mechanism doesn't seem to do anything until you turn around and notice that the entrance to the room has changed and now leads somewhere else. Some of these entrances are completely blocked and lead nowhere, and to move the entrance again the mechanism needs to be activated. There were multiple orientations of the room, each of which were accessible in a sequence. However, after having mapped which orientation takes you to which entrance, it was still necessary to activate the mechanism over and over again, watching the same animation play out multiple times, just so you could reach the entrance you wanted. Once more your father contacts you and this time warns that soon he will lose control of himself, implying some dreadful events will happen as a result. But he's cut off again, because the signal down here is just not that good. Besides the circular room with questionable gameplay design, some of the areas reachable through the entrances are more interesting, even if they too sometimes feature some curious animations. One of the areas I call the pit, which just has a hole in it that has a treasure chest, protected by a spike trap that activates as you get too close. The second area is the garden, where you can find a locked entrance with a curiously shaped keyhole. There's also a fountain filled with water and two statues representing different astrological constellations, with devices adorned with multiple buttons with different colors on them being affixed to the pedestals in front of the statues. There's also an area which has a stained glass window depicting a woman of some sort and what seems to be a vampire in the foreground. The fourth area is a hallway with multiple suits of armor and a pit at the end. As you reach the pit, one of the suits of armor is revealed to have come alive, which leads to a QTE. Thankfully, failing the event doesn't lead to death, but instead merely pushes you into the pit, allowing you to climb out again to retry. The QTE itself is relatively standard, though the window of opportunity to press each of the buttons correctly is somewhat short. This is pretty much irrelevant, however, as while it's likely to lead to a couple attempts, the actual sequence doesn't change, so all it really requires is a little bit of memorization to complete the QTE. Once you do win against a knight, it's pushed into the pit and breaks into pieces, giving Laura a nice sword, which the player might immediately figure out what to use on. The next room is an observatory, where you can use a lever to change the orientation of the telescope, seeing many different constellations in different colors. This is also where I feel like DE commits one of the biggest sins of adventure gaming. While the puzzle itself is in theory very simple, and I can guarantee many of you've already figured out what the purpose of the room is, however, as someone who's not at all interested in astrology, solving this puzzle required me to look up information from outside of the game. This I find unacceptable in games, as I consider it a failure when a game doesn't include all of the information required to beat it within the game itself. Sure, these days it's just simple to fire up a search engine to look up the symbols representing each of the constellations in the zodiac, but in the mid-90s, this could have been a point where a player either has to put the game down for a while, which, because of the lack of a save system, would mean having to restart it from the beginning, or have to do a trial and error with the colors, completely bypassing the purpose of the puzzle in the first place. After solving the puzzle, the water from the fountain drains into the pit, and the player has to use the mechanism in the circular room multiple times to change the entrance again, so they can actually reach the pit. Looking up the recording, this took 2.5 minutes of just activating the mechanism and playing through the same animation over and over again. Once you reach the pit, you get the gift of gun, and yet another vision from your still very impatient father, who just seems to hide his ethereal vision self to fuck with Laura at this point.
Laura. Laura. Laura.
He explains that he's transforming, and whatever he's becoming he can't control, and this thing will have need of Laura in some way. Now with a gun, you can America your way through the stained glass window, showing you're in a tower of some sort, as Laura climbs even higher, which once more locks you into a completely new area, unable to return. Being pestered by your troll father again, he now explains even more about the nature of his transformation.
Laura, we are cursed. In our veins flows the blood of Dracula.
Yes, D is a game about Dracula, kind of, and seemingly Laura's family are his descendants. I mentioned a vision early on during the game where the player was shown a woman at the dinner table. If the player is to explore the areas thoroughly, it's possible to find even more of these visions, each of which slowly builds a more complete picture of what you're seeing. In the end, it's revealed that the visions are flashbacks of a repressed memory, where Dracula's bloodline caused Laura to snap, assaulting her mother and cannibalizing her corpse. After one more puzzle, you find your mother's portrait, which launches a surreal vision, after which you find yourself in the same room with your father. He explains that eventually everyone who's had the blood of Dracula in them will begin to crave human flesh, something which happened to Laura, but somehow her father managed to erase her memory and stop Dracula from possessing her. Having finished his monologue, he begins to transform and exclaims that he needs your flesh. This leads to a decision where if you walk towards the father, it's heavily implied that he eats Laura, and his transformation into Dracula will be complete. The other option is to America your father, which removes the strange filter from his 3D model and restores him to his senses. Before dying, he explains that he was an idiot, and while knowing what was happening, just wanted to see what would happen out of scientific curiosity. Regardless, he's still as trolly as ever, and I'm convinced he decided to die mid-sentence completely out of spite, as the world around you transforms back into the hospital.
I love you. My last wish is that
D is an interesting game. At its core, it's a very standard FMV adventure game with a relatively small amount of puzzles, but with a decent variety in them. There are some points where the game design is questionable and seems to be there only to make you spend a little bit more time between locations. Where D excels, however, is in the mood. The environments combined with the droning ambiance manage to keep up this kind of oppressive atmosphere, though I'm not sure if it would have worked quite as well had the game been much longer. The story itself is kinda silly, but in a fun way. The reveal that D is about Dracula was clearly intended as a shocking moment, but there were enough clues within the relatively small amount of information that I had already come to the conclusion myself at that point. Perhaps the stained glass window with a very obvious vampire depicted on it was the final straw where I went, yeah, this is about Dracula, huh? Granted, I wasn't prepared for the lore rewrite about Dracula, where instead of a bog-standard vampire story, the Dracula bloodline in this case seems to also include elements of cannibalism, while being mixed in with the more classic supernatural vampire lore. The slower nature of gameplay, I think, isn't for everyone, which is one of the reasons why I wouldn't really wholeheartedly recommend D as something to play. Sure, it's not that long and in fact has to be completed within 2 hours, but it can feel much longer if you're not comfortable with long periods of the game doing more than you are. I think D is for people who enjoyed watching Cade the Tortured Crossing despite it going far too long for its own good. Thankfully, I'm one of those people. In many ways, I would compare D to something Neil Breen would have directed. Not everything immediately makes sense, the dialogue can be somewhat confusing sometimes, and the ending can come off as extremely weird. But there's just something in the combination of all the elements which makes the whole a surprisingly fascinating experience, which is probably the best way to explain D. As a game, it's okay. It's not terrible, nor is it particularly great, but if you're okay with a slow and atmospheric experience, then D just might be for you. D isn't the end of the Kenji Eno saga, and probably to the dismay of many, for this video I'm skipping Enemy Zero. I think that one deserves its own video someday in the future. Not sure when. One day, most likely. Mostly because, honestly, I didn't edit that. That is how Enemy Zero begins. For now, I want to look at D2 instead, which isn't available on the PC and is instead a Dreamcast exclusive. D2 begins with a snowy landscape and a 3D model of the game's logo, which has the appearance of being covered in blood, or consisting of it completely. This time there's also an actual main menu where you can start the game, load the game, change some very simplistic settings, or watch the introductory video, which for some reason has been placed on disc 4. The video begins with a man walking in snow, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. As we zoom closer, we are shown the man is wounded as splatters of red blood are in the tracks he leaves behind him. As he walks further, the splatters change color from red to green, and we hear a groan as the logo of the game comes on the screen. We transition into a cabin where a woman is tending a fire, and another one sleeping on a bed. A view of the stars is shown until a meteor comes into view, heading towards Earth. As the meteor is about to collide, a blinding light appears above the planet, seemingly acting as a shield. The meteor is being held in place as pieces of it break off, but one of those manages to break through the barrier protecting Earth. We transition yet again, this time to a computer screen, showing the date is Christmas Day in the year 2000. We see that the person writing this is the woman seen sleeping in the cabin, now napping on an airplane. We're shown some of the other passengers, including the other woman in the cabin earlier, and one of them speaks. He's picked up this woman's compact and intends to hand it back. We find out that the woman's called Laura, and the compact was a gift from her mother. There's also a very stereotypical cultist on the plane, chanting something about chaos and Shadow the final destroyer. Suddenly, things go awry and terrorists take over the plane. The man who talked to Laura has his own weapon and takes down one of the terrorists, after which the compact begins to glow, showing him a vision of a meteor striking the plane. He grabs Laura and begins to run towards the end of the plane, but what he saw indeed happens and the plane crashes into the Canadian wilderness. The opening video does a pretty good job at being confusing, but also having some nice homages to the first game, and also giving me a well, what the heck is this game gonna be about? The man in the snow isn't explained at all. Why is his blood a changing color? Is it a mistake? Is this the same Laura from the first game? What is the Shield of Light? What's with the cultist terrorists? And the final destroyer? Of course, we get no answers, which was great. As for Laura, he's not the same one. It's just a character who looks very similar. This was a kind of warped tradition for the few games they ended up making, as they had what they called digital actors they reused in different roles in each game. Starting the actual game, we transition immediately to Laura sleeping at the cabin, as she wakes up seemingly unaware of where she is. The other woman notices this and begins to explain the situation. She explains that the plane crashed 10 days ago and that she found Laura unconscious in the snow the day before yesterday, after which Laura's been sleeping the whole time. She doesn't know how Laura managed to survive all this time and asks if Laura has any memories of the preceding events, which she doesn't. The woman introduces herself as Kimberly and is about to hand Laura something to drink, but this is interrupted by one of the terrorists barging into the cabin, clearly in some kind of distress. The reason for this is quickly shown as he begins to transform into some kind of a plant-like monster, shocking both women. Kimberly grabs a shotgun but is frozen in terror as a tentacle sprouts from the terrorists and does what tentacles do in Japanese animated media. Seeing this, Laura grabs a gun, and we see a very short first-person view with a crosshair until the game transitions to another cutscene where someone off-screen shoots the monster, which releases Kimberly, and eventually escapes from the cabin. The shooter introduces himself as Parker, but doesn't get a warm welcome from Kimberly, who demands him to leave. Parker gives some information intended to explain to the player the setting of the game. He says that whatever happened to the terrorist is called blossoming, and there are many more of those monsters outside, seemingly having transformed from the passengers of the plane. He also explains that the color of a person's blood is the only way to know for sure whether the person's infected or not, as the ones who've become these creatures bleed green instead of red. He also throws multiple disclaimers about not being sure if all monsters bleed green, or if all people who bleed green will become monsters, adding some uncertainty to the entire situation, which has some the thing-like qualities. As Parker leaves, Kimberly is visibly upset at herself for freezing like she did. Once the situation calms down, Kimberly asks about someone called Janny, a little child with whom she apparently found Laura, but who's now gone missing. Laura doesn't remember anything of the sort, but Kimberly says that perhaps Janny remembers Laura, so finding her should be your first priority. Not only because having a child alone in the wilderness with plant monsters going around isn't particularly safe, but also because she might be able to shed light on your situation. D2 consists of a couple different gameplay styles, the first of which is introduced immediately after the introductory cutscenes. You now have control of Laura, as you get to explore the insides of the cabin. This functions in a very similar fashion to the gameplay of D. You're stuck in a hotspot and can use the movement controls to turn the camera from one predetermined view to another. By using the forward movement button, you can attempt to move from one spot to another or interact with the environmental object in front of you. You can also hold a free look button, which allows the player to somewhat pan the camera around the predetermined view. This feature becomes immediately useful, as in the initial view you begin the game in, you can see a box of shotgun shells, or as they're called in the texture, spear bullets, but can't actually interact with the box in the default view. Instead, as you use the free look mode to pan towards the box, a vignette effect appears on the screen, signifying that you can now pick that object up. There are other objects as well that can be picked up, such as traditional survival horror style healing sprays. Examining the cabin, you find your first weapon, a submachine gun. This starting segment shows many similarities D2 has with the first D. Exploration segments function almost identically to D in how you move around the areas and how examining things closely brings up a somewhat slow-moving cutscene depicting Laura interacting with the objects. Though now with more characters in the game, you can actually talk to other people. Though just like in the first game, Laura seems to be mostly mute and merely reacts in exclamations. The background audio is very somber and atmospheric, consisting mostly of noises such as the howling wind outside the cabin instead of music, as musical stingers tend to be reserved for highlighting specific situations once more. There are some changes to the D formula, however, one of which is the speed of transitional animations, which in the first game were quite slow. In D2, moving around the exploration hotspots is much faster, which is a very good upgrade in my opinion. Once you leave the cabin, another gameplay feature is introduced, as Kimberly asks Laura whether she's shot anything before, leading to a hunting tutorial. You enter a first-person view looking like a very shaky scope, as you're tasked to shoot a rabbit. Movement buttons can be used to target the animal, and the shoulder buttons are used to adjust the zoom level. However, you can't shoot yet since Laura's not really feeling up to it, which leads to Kimberly convincing Laura about the necessity to hunt for food in this cold environment.
You think it's cruel? I did too at first. But you know, I spoke with this Norwegian hunter in a tavern, and he said even rabbits and mice have killer instinct, and that there's no such thing in this world as absolute prey or an absolute predator.
Well, this might sound silly, but we've all seen the legendary beast of Ah! Now you can finally press the action button to shoot with a rifle, and if you manage to hit a rabbit, a pop-up showing that you've acquired meat appears. After 2 more rabbits, Kimberly gives you a portable cooker which she explains automatically cleans and cooks the meat. In practice, meat is a replenishable healing source that can be gathered if one can manage the very shaky scope view, which honestly was giving me a headache at points. Another change from D is that you actually have a pause menu. In this stylized view, there are 6 different tabs that can be activated, and at the top of the screen is information about Laura, including her current and maximum HP, something called skill, experience points, and her current level, showing that there is some kind of a character progression system in place. The first tab can be activated to open a map of the region you're currently in, where a cursor can be moved around to highlight specific points of interest. The second tab is your inventory view, where you can select items to see more detailed information about them. The third is your weapons view, which functions in a similar way to the inventory view, but just for your weapons. The fourth is the archive that contains detailed information of the people and concepts you've encountered so far. The fifth is a hunting and photography tab, which is mostly just for statistics about how many animals you've hunted. Unfortunately, the photography didn't seem to function properly on the emulator, so I didn't get much use out of that. Finally, there's the saving tab, where on each memory card you can save into 3 slots. The saving system is available everywhere during exploration, and there doesn't seem to be any limits on how often you can save. This begins the next gameplay segment, as you now find yourself in a surprisingly good-looking wide outdoors, where you can move freely within the bounds of the world to explore. Moving Laura functions similarly to survival horror games of the era. Left and right turn her around, while up moves her forwards and down either has her backstep or turn around, depending on how much you press on the analog controller. While moving around, you can find items on the ground, such as a new weapon, a consumable grenade, or a G-bomb, as has been written on it. If you see wild animals, you can enter hunting mode, which is done by opening a quick inventory view, which opens a scrollable list of items at the bottom left of the screen, from where you can activate items such as healing items or the hunting rifle, which then opens the scope view seen in the tutorial segment. Eventually, you'll encounter another gameplay mode, which is combat. Unlike most survival horror games that have the enemies be a part of regular gameplay, in D2, combat scenarios take the shape of random encounters where up to 3 enemies pop up from beneath the snow to attack you. While in combat, you're rooted in place and are moving a target crosshair across the screen. If there are multiple enemies or an enemy that moves around, arrows begin flashing on the screen, indicating that you can press one of the face buttons to reorient the view in that direction. Since your first weapon has infinite ammunition, scarcity isn't much of an issue, but reloading is still a necessity, and the ammunition counter is shown on the weapon icon at the bottom right of the screen. Your current health is shown at the bottom of the screen with the color of the UI element representing how close to maximum health you are, going from red to yellow to green. Health can be replenished during combat by entering the inventory view, which also pauses the game, making it easier to find and consume any healing items. If you pause firing, multiple rectangles begin flashing on the enemies, showing their hitboxes. And if the rectangle is of a different color, it indicates a weak spot you can fire at to deal even more damage. After dispatching the enemies, you get to listen to a somewhat out-of-place funky beat, as you're shown the amount of experience you've gained and also the total experience you've accumulated. If you gain enough experience to level up, that too is shown on this screen. Leveling up does multiple things. The primary parts are that on each level Laura gains more maximum health and also more skill, which according to the manual affects the amount of damage dealt on enemies. Each level as well replenishes all of Laura's HP, which is very useful considering the rather vast outdoor environments there are to explore. I find this mixture of different gameplay styles to be quite fascinating. While indoors it feels like you're playing a somewhat moody first-person adventure game, outside the gameplay feels more reminiscent of a standard survival horror game with tank controls and environments devoid of other living humans. But then there are also the random encounters, which are a classic JRPG trope, but they take the form of first-person shooter segments similar to on-rails shooters, where you're controlling a crosshair instead of the character. At this point, I was honestly not sure how I should feel about D2, as it didn't seem to conform to any of my expectations, but was instead a combination of elements I had not at all expected. In the beginning, it might not be clear to the player what they're meant to do, which is to be expected in games like these, but D2 does try to guide the player towards the right direction in several different ways. For example, at this point the only clue the player has been given is to search for the missing girl Janny, and going back to the cabin to talk to Kimberly just gives a repetition of this task. The rest of the guidance comes in the form of map design, as you only have one path away from the cabin, which leads into a narrow pass, where a small stone hut resides. Here, D2 assumes the player would be curious enough to explore everything they can, which leads to the second first-person exploration segment, where you go through hotspots inside the stone hut. Within are a few hotspots the player can't do anything with, signifying that they might have a purpose later in the game, but the main purpose here is examining a photograph of an old man and a young child. The photograph seems to have some kind of a recording device attached to it, which automatically plays as Laura picks up the photograph.
Happy birthday! Happy birthday to you! Happy birthday, dear Grandpa!
As she picks up the photo again, revealed by the audio recording to depict Janny and her grandfather, whom she was coming to visit for Christmas, she pricks her finger, revealing to the player that according to what has been learned so far, she still seems to be human. Unfortunately, this marks the point in the game where the player gets the least amount of direction, which is a shame as it's the very beginning of the gameplay segment. Having now found Janny's grandfather's hut, the player is meant to go back to Kimberly to inform that they didn't find Janny, but the rest of the area is also available for exploration with 2 dead ends marking both paths. Sure, it means that the player will gain a decent amount of experience fighting the random encounters during the explorations, but the time it takes to explore the alternate paths can also feel long, especially since there's little to no direction the player's been given yet, potentially making the trek feel pointless. It also highlights one issue with having a mostly mute protagonist, as a character musing to themselves is often used as a way to give little clues to the player, so the lack of the feature means that other ways of guiding the player are needed. Which in this case is intended to be the connection between finding a photo of Janny, having heard you can only go so far in the snow, and the task to find a Janny, leading the player to think they have to go back to the cabin. Returning there, Kimberly is slightly more cooperative as she now decides to explain that she locked the cabinet at the stone hut to prevent the monsters from getting their tentacles on the weapons, and gives you the key to it. Back at the hut, using the key on the cabinet shows a slight difference in the adventure gaming segments when compared to the first D, as while the movement and the animations are similar in style, there is no key item inventory, and items such as keys will be automatically used when interacting with the appropriate world object. In the cabinet, you find a G-bomb and a portable radio with a cassette player. Considering how the gameplay's gone so far, I'm sure you can guess what needs to be done next. Yep, running back to the cabin. I'll be honest, at the start of D2, I was almost ready to just quit the game. It hadn't been particularly interesting, the frequent random encounters were distracting from the feeling of loneliness during exploration, and the game up to this point had been just running between 2 buildings. But I decided to continue, which was a good idea. In the cabin, you get to see one of the more intimate moments between the 2 ladies as Kimberly opens up more about herself. She has a tape with her containing a piece of music to which she wrote the lyrics. In a way, as she's a poet and someone read one of them and wanted to write a piece of music around it. She says that poetry is a form of escapism for her, a way to create her own worlds outside the real one, which has not been the most pleasant for her. For a poet, though, she's not the most subtle with explaining about her past.
Well, there's one thing I could say for sure about my life. I had a second chance, I wouldn't want to be born as myself again. No way. Anything but that. I don't want to go through it again. Not my father's accidental death. Not my mother's suicide. None of it. At first, I tried escaping through drugs.
Unfortunately, the bonding experience is interrupted by the tape jamming, which leads to more pressing issues being discussed. As Kimberly says, it's now been 10 days since the accident and there's been no sign of any rescue parties. She also presumes that you must have been with someone else during the 8-day period before she found you, and says that it would be a good idea to find this person, as they should be able to explain more about what happened during that time. Leaving the cabin, the game finally gives the player some proper direction, as the radio somehow receives an emergency signal from the plane that fell, giving a proper direction on where to explore next. Even though the world isn't terribly complex, you finally have more use for the map, which can be used to pinpoint the location of the crash site. In the plane, you face a very gruesome sight, followed by another one, as a flight attendant clearly infected with whatever is turning people monsters gets up and shows the player one of the more disturbing aspects of the creatures, as they seem to be locked in a state of looping the infected person's desires and routines.
Is everything all right, ma'am? Our current location is above Canada from the Prialis star cluster on red high-heel shoes.
This leads to the first boss battle of the game, which has some interesting features. While it's possible to just keep shooting at the flight attendant, stopping shooting for a while to let the weak point indicators appear shows that for some reason a butterfly flying in the combat arena is a weak point, and shooting it deals a massive amount of damage to the boss. Sometimes though, the butterfly lands on your weapon, and the only way to get it to fly away again seems to be to change your weapon, which works in a similar way to scrolling through items, except the weapon selector is on the right side of the screen. Once you defeat the boss, she blossoms even more and Kimberly appears to rescue you, leading to even more discussion, which some might call slightly pretentious.
Hey, look. There's a butterfly. I wonder if that's a symbol of that stewardess's wish to fly.
She also explains that she found a snowmobile, though it's almost out of gas, so you need to find some to leave the area. Up until this point, Kimberly hasn't known Laura's name, but now she calls her by her name, and reveals she found Laura's compact and read the engraving on it. Then suddenly, Laura falls unconscious and sees a vision, which begins almost as impatiently as the visions in the first D.
Laura. Laura. Are you alright?
This vision explains that the man you were with was the same man who Laura talked to in the introductory cutscene called David Brenner. Other than that, not much is revealed that wasn't revealed in the cutscene already. As Laura wakes up, Kimberly decides you both need a rest and should take the snowmobile back to the cabin. During the ride, Kimberly says that if you survive, she'll write a poem for Laura themed around light, because that's what she brought into her life. As Laura sleeps, we see a short vision of the weird cultist man from the plane wading through the snow, after which Laura wakes up again and finds a note from Kimberly, which states that she's now much happier than she was before meeting Laura, and that she left looking for gas. Leaving the cabin, Laura tries to start the snowmobile, which has now completely run out of gas, and instead takes the keys with her, as they have another key connected to them, which might be useful. This point also shows one of the more cool features of the game. Even though it's completely story progression related, there is a kind of day-night cycle in play, which just amplifies how good the game looks. While D2 doesn't give particularly great hints for your quest to find more gas, thankfully there really aren't many options, as looking at the map it seems like there's only one pathway that hasn't yet had any significance in the story, which leads to a mine owned by the Tyrell Corporation, which is probably not related to that Tyrell Corporation. Once you reach the mine, the entrance is unfortunately locked, but there is a conveniently parked truck that provides some shelter. Having taken a set of keys, it makes sense to see if the unused one in the keyring would fit the truck, and it does, causing the truck to suddenly speed off as the gas pedal seems stuck to the floor and the brakes are frozen in extreme cold. But not all is lost, as you now have opened the gate and can enter the mines. Though at this point there's not much to explore, as your progress is impeded by a keypad requiring a 4-number code, which can be input by moving Laura's finger on the numbers and pressing the buttons with the action button. And for those who might wonder, of course I tried that code immediately and nothing happened. Not knowing what else to do, you eventually leave and get ambushed by another speeding truck, driven by an old, crazed man. Not knowing if the driver is a human or monster, Laura does the only sensible thing and begins blasting. The man has a keycard hanging on his neck, and while Laura attempts to take it, the man gets up, blossoms, and shows very similar behavior to the flight attendant.
Hi, Jenny. It's Grandpa. Do you recognize me? We can see each other soon. I look forward to Christmas.
This leads to the second boss battle, where the magic trick-loving Grandpa keeps summoning birds, most of which don't particularly like him, and instead help you in the fight. Eventually the old man falls and, like any good magician, ends the show with a bang. Now the keycard is accessible, but while picking it up, Laura sees the photograph behind the card, depicting Jenny with her grandfather, which for some reason shocks her, despite the Blossom old man having made it very clear that he is Jenny's grandfather, but oh well. This shock causes Laura to pass out, and we see another vision with David, who seems to be wounded and bedridden. During their time together, David told Laura much about his life, including how he used to grow up around this area, and carries with him a dried flower as a good luck charm, something which reminds him of his mother who used to press flowers. Laura wakes up back in the cabin, finding out that Kimberly found her and brought her back. She reassures Laura that she did nothing wrong, as Jenny's grandfather had blossomed, and would have killed her had she not done what she did. Then we find out that Kimberly routinely uses some sort of a medicine called Linda.
It's called Linda. It's very popular these days. It helps me relax and somehow seems to make everything crystal clear. I guess it sort of frees you.
Surely there's nothing to worry about here. She recalls Laura used to call the name David in her sleep, so both of our leads now know the name of the person Laura spent time with before Kimberly found her. And so, Kimberly gives Laura a flashlight and leaves to look for gasoline, giving control back to the player. Having been transported back into the cabin ends up being a good thing, since the run back from the mine would have been a long one. And now with Jenny's grandfather's keycard, you can finally open up the safe in the stone hut, where a new weapon can be found. And also a very clear note depicting a randomly chosen 4-number keycode that changes on every playthrough. Laura also finds a walkie-talkie, which dies just after she hears Jenny cry out for help from inside the mine. As you try to leave, you hear 2 voices approaching and Laura hides under the bed. A man and a woman enter the hut, with the woman seemingly threatening the man with a shotgun, demanding answers to her questions. The man is apparently one of the 2 terrorists on the plane, with the other one revealed to be called Larry. He claims that Larry wants to resurrect the Shadow or something, which apparently has something to do with a strange cultist. He explains that they've been taking Linda, which has made them see visions of things, such as a huge shining seed stuck in ice, which he somehow felt was this Shadow. Other than that, this man doesn't know more, but is very scared, as Larry blossomed and tried to eat him, and now he just wants to survive.
You're one tough broad. I like that. I've always had a thing for strong women, too. Hey, say, why don't we pop some Linda and do a little of this, huh?
This attempt at charming doesn't end up going well, and while we don't see exactly what happens, the woman goes silent and kills the man without a weapon before shambling out of the hut. With the code, you can finally enter the mines, which has a unique gameplay segment that only appears in D2 once, where instead of the hotspot-based exploration, you need to explore a maze-like mine in first-person view to find the pathway forwards, while periodically fighting random encounters against mutated miners. The controls to this sequence are moderately clunky, as they are still based on the tank control style, while also managing to be somehow less smooth than similar controls in games like Wolfenstein 3D. But since you don't actually need to fight in this mode of movement, it's really not an issue. The rest of the mines are a longer sequence of the hotspot-based exploration segments, which could showcase one of the more annoying parts of the system. As explained at the beginning of the game, there are multiple items in the world you can only pick up by being in a very specific orientation in the scene and then using the free look function to adjust the view towards the item. Sometimes hotspots become unavailable after completing a task, which will then lead to the items from those hotspots also becoming unavailable to pick up. In the end, you find a canister of gas and also Jenny, who came into the mines looking for her grandpa who works in these mines. This happy reunion is quickly interrupted as the ground begins to shake and the mines start to collapse. Everything goes dark and Laura sees another vision, this time not narrated by David, but instead by yet another impatient character.
Laura, Laura, Laura. Awake, Laura Parton, in the name of the Great Mother.
The Great Mother says that Laura must fight for the future of all mankind and of all the life that the Great Mother has created. As the vision Laura walks through a door, it changes to show the distant past, showing the beginning of the extinction of the dinosaurs as things like a depiction of the genetic code quickly flash on the screen. Laura once more wakes up in the cabin, though this time Kimberly didn't carry her there, but instead she saw a bright yellow light which crashed through the cabin roof, dropping Laura and Jenny on the bed, something which Kimberly seems to just accept as something that happened without really questioning it. We quickly move away from the clear supernatural implications of Laura being on a mission from what amounts to a god and being protected by this very being in tangible ways, and instead go into the less fun aspect of Jenny having to find out that her grandfather's dead. We also get some indications that perhaps everyone's actually already dead, or that they were dead, but might have been resurrected by the Great Mother for a purpose.
Laura was all by herself, just like me. We were walking. Then Laura suddenly went to sleep. So I went to sleep too. Next thing I know, we're here with you.
At this point, I was hooked. Since while D2 started a bit slow and tedious, it had now gone places I didn't expect and really wanted to see how twisted and strange it could get as the game goes even further. After all, from the initial tedium came rather standard flashback sequences intended to give information little by little, revealing the events of the missing week. But then the story began to really go places and the whole doomsday cult aspect has appeared in full force. Similarly, the throwaway line by Parker at the beginning now seems more important, as the woman who killed the terrorist at the Stone Heart was very obviously Kimberly, or at least so it seems. Even on a surface level, the story had picked up, and that's not even taking into account the potential purpose of all the dialogue that seems to focus mostly on the personal traumas of each of the characters. Now, with the snowmobile refueled and the bonding experience over, the trio take off and ride across the snowy plains to the beat of a D-theme remix. We get another glimpse of the cultist wading through the snow as our trio finds a house and decide to explore inside. The building seems abandoned and Kimberly asks Laura to examine the house in more detail as she takes Jenny with her to explore a yellow light she saw further ahead. As expected, exploring the house is done in the adventure gameplay segment, and aside from some supplies, nothing much can be found, until you reach a door. Climbing from the ledge, Laura hears commotion in the lobby, where a crazed man in a lab coat is threatening Kimberly, who suddenly appeared in the house and lost all of her clothing. The man keeps eating handfuls of Linda and explains that it's a new, more potent version. He seems to believe that Kimberly is not human and has instead been infected by whatever makes people mutants. He says that he saw Kimberly mutate into monster and eat his father, and in a frenzy tries to get her to mutate. Laura, despite trying to remain hidden, accidentally turns on the light and gets found. The man ties both of the women onto chairs and explains that he intends to do a little test, where he shoots each of the women in the leg, and if the blood is green, he knows that person is in fact a mutant. The crazed man continues his ramblings and pops even more Linda, nicely modeled to show each of the capsules in glorious 3D, which I have to point out since, as a reminder, this was in 1999 and the game is absolutely gorgeous for its time. After a lengthy monologue, he commences his experiments and shoots Kimberly on the foot, which bleeds green, showing that she's indeed been infected. But instead of immediately shooting her, the man hesitates after hearing the telltale sounds of blossoming, and a mouth sprouts from Kimberly's stomach, eating his head. Then she frees herself and clearly prepares to eat Laura too, until Kimberly comes in through the door and shoots the other Kimberly. Everyone being very confused right now, Kimberly breaks down in tears after having shot a monster that looks identical to herself, which leads to our lead finally saying the first words during the game.
Laura, are you all right? I guess I'm over it now.
I know you gentlemen have been through a lot. But when you find the time, I'd rather not spend the rest of this winter tied to this fucking couch!
Fine, she still remains mute, but you can't deny the scene is very reminiscent of The Thing. As Kimberly frees Laura from the chair, the mutant attacks the woman, knocking the original Kimberly unconscious, which leads to the next boss battle that ends up being relatively simple and mostly takes advantage of the U-turn mechanic, as the mutant Kimberly keeps moving around the ceiling, which is a slight change from the previous bosses that were mostly stationary. After the battle, Kimberly reassures Laura that she's really her and bites her cheek to show that she bleeds red. She presumes that the plant monsters can somehow clone other people's appearances from a DNA sample, which she would have provided the Larry monster at the beginning of the game during the mouth tentacle sequence. She explains that she was on a plane because of the drug Linda, and after a while of using it she began seeing visions of a landscape, feeling like she was being called there. Then she read an article about the drug and saw that landscape when the report mentioned the origin of the drug, made from a lichen that only grows in one place on the planet. We also hear that according to some reports, Linda can trigger a kind of psychosis in some people which has resulted in violent cannibalistic outbursts. She also expresses some remorse about how she treated Parker and hopes that he's still alive. As you try to leave, Kimberly explains that there's some kind of a storage facility further up the hill nearby and hands you the key to it, but also says that it's so cold you can't stay there for long. This finally opens up a new gameplay feature, as you're now able to use the snowmobile to traverse the outdoors, resulting in much faster movement between areas, though the controls can be a little bit janky. While the movement speed's faster, that does not prevent random encounters from happening, so even with the new traversal method, that is occasionally interrupted by enemies popping out from beneath the snow. One interesting aspect about the enemies is that now in the new area there are some different enemy models, and some that are already familiar from the first area have been changed in their color palette, signifying the increased difficulty of the enemies. The storage facility can be found by following a very linear path, and entering it has the player engage in a simple puzzle, where the number from the key needs to be input into the console using switches that represent numbers in the binary system. Inside, Laura finds another dead Kimberly clone, which we can assume was shown by the real Kimberly when she explored the area earlier, prompting her to quickly return to Laura. Deeper inside the facility are a frozen hatch, and another binary input console, this time with even more levers, and the answer to the puzzle conveniently written on a piece of paper. Inside the locked room is a strange machine with a display and a button, pressing which randomly generates a 6-number sequence that for now seems to do nothing. One interesting aspect about Act 2 is that there is a large area that is completely optional and has nothing to do with the main storyline, and thus can be skipped altogether. But it does have a purpose, as it contains extra resources the player can collect, including multiple respawning animals that can be hunted for their meat. Much further, Laura finds an observatory with a locked gate that can be opened with a 6-number keycode. Within the building, she encounters a dying partially mutated man who's talking to someone called Linda. He's talking about the upcoming extinction of all humanity and seems pleased that he and Linda can spend their final moments together. As he notices Laura, he pleads with her not to come closer, as he's fully aware of the implications of the mutation. He then reminisces with Linda, who seems to be a computer simulation of the man's dead wife, about their past lives. Then he explains that he went somewhat mad after her wife died, and his only desire was to see the world burn, using the wealth gained from selling Linda to fund his obsession to predict when the end of humanity would happen. He eventually found a connection with eclipses and the cycle of extinction. Once he managed to calculate when the end of the world would occur, he'd changed his mind and instead wanted to save humanity. But it was too late, and merely days remained until the predicted date. That date has now passed, and the meteor that fell on Earth awakened something, which is now mutating humanity with the intention to destroy the entire species. He asks Laura to give him, and all of his research, a dignified end, which in practice means breaking a storage cabinet containing a flamethrower and then burning everything inside the observatory with it. After torching the place, Laura sees another vision with David. That makes some things exceedingly clear. After the crash, David was severely wounded, and at this point has likely died. We can also deduce that the man who created Linda was the father of the crazed man killed by the Kimberly clone, and another one of the clones is responsible for attacking him at some point. Overall, that means that now the entire family's died while in the vicinity of Laura. With a flamethrower, it's possible to re-enter the storage facility and melt the lock on the frozen trapdoor, which hides a secret laboratory within. Inside of the cold lab, there are a large amount of sprouts, presumably from the plants used to manufacture Linda. At the end, you find a confirmation that the crazed man indeed was David's brother, and Laura finally recovers some of her memory, clearly recognizing David from the photograph. But nothing can go well, and the person who's seemingly Kimberly and was previously seen killing someone at the stone hut closes the trapdoor and activates the freezing mechanism in a clear attempt to kill Laura. As the temperature lowers, she passes out and has another vision of the Great Mother, who reiterates that she must rise up and fight for all of humanity, as the vision morphs to show an eclipse and visions of the Roman Empire, which, considering the themes of everything so far, are likely to mean that the fall of the Roman Empire had something to do with the same force that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and is now attempting to cause the extinction of humanity. Then we transition to Parker's car as a bright yellow light appears and crashes into his vehicle, completely trashing the engine. Within the yellow light was Laura, and after the initial confusion, Parker as well just seems to accept that this is something that happened. As he engages in small talk asking about Kimberly, she appears on the snowmobile with Jenny, who also seems to have had a vision of the Great Mother. Kimberly mentions that they saw a house further ahead with lights on and smoke coming out of the chimney, so she assumes that would be a good place to explore, hoping that perhaps the inhabitants of the building would be hospitable. So our crew heads there, and the next we see is the group eating dinner inside while having a discussion about various things, such as the potentially divine nature of the yellow light, which seems to be protecting Laura, and also of how Parker is a member of an organization examining the existence of the extraterrestrial intelligence, which is why he's here, as his organization had intercepted a strange signal. He also explains that he believes the meteors that ended up killing the dinosaurs are connected to the meteor that struck the plane at the beginning. After some interpersonal drama between our characters, we find out that there's indeed someone living inside the building, but they refuse to leave their room.
Go away! I don't know who you are or what you want, but I have to play this song right! Practice, 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 practice. Do you understand? Now leave me alone!
But at least they gave the party permission to stay downstairs, so that's nice. Having little choice but to rest before wandering outside into the world of the third disc of the game, Laura rests for a while, as the players are given another view into the trek of the weird cultist who seems to have finally reached his destination. Waking up, Laura finds Parker and Kimberly engaging in more interpersonal drama, as Parker is very much against using Linda to numb the senses and avoid feeling regular human emotions, though some of his emotions do go a little bit overboard.
I'd rather turn into a monster and not have to think or remember or feel anything anymore.
Don't say things like that. I'm so sorry.
After his outburst, Parker is immediately remorseful, but Kimberly is understandably not particularly receptive to it, and he leaves to explore. From a gameplay perspective, the third disc is much of the same. There's a new area to explore with some hidden pieces of equipment buried in the snow. The enemies are now even tougher, but also give more experience, so scaling Laura to the difficulty shouldn't take too many encounters to accomplish. There are even more quirky characters, such as an old priest who talks to Laura of a prophecy which seems to describe the events currently happening and how Laura is destined to be here to defeat an ancient god of destruction.
Destiny's child is she who stands before us. Born on both shores of history and fated to be here at this moment.
While the gameplay doesn't really evolve, the environments are still very pretty, and it's quite cool that you can now see in the distance the mountain top onto which the meteor struck, and where the cultist was last seen. There is one puzzle though that's almost as unforgivable as the Zodiac puzzle in the first game, as this time we have a music puzzle requiring the player to input a few notes that follow the notes heard at the start of the puzzle. While it's a very familiar tune for many, and the correct keys to press can be found from the glossary of terms inside the main menu, what the game does not do is explain the player what each of the keys are, so there's still some amount of potential outside knowledge needed. Perhaps it's because I've had music in my life since I was a child, I didn't find this quite as egregious as having to know the symbols of the zodiac, but for those who don't know musical terms or the keys of the piano, well, yeah, this might be one of the puzzles one has to bing. Even if there are no significant additions on the gameplay front, aside from getting a new, more powerful gun with infinite ammo, though it only has a semi-automatic mode on it, the story moves at a relatively brisk pace. The crazed pianist suddenly disappears, leaving behind a key to his mother's house, who seems to have driven his son a little bit crazy by being an amazing mother who only wants the best for his son.
I made him practice the piano every day. Locked him in the cellar and forced him to play from morning till night. And finally, I brought him here to the middle of nowhere so he would have nothing but his piano.
Kimberly and Jenny both disappear. The piano man is found dead in his secret room, and Parker explains that the path to the final chapter is blocked by a huge gate that needs explosives to open, and the signal he's been tracking is on the other side of the gate as well. The prophet priest is found dead, and for some reason he just happens to have timed explosives in his cupboard, which is convenient. We also get a meeting with Larry the terrorist, who seems to have regained some of his humanity, feeling remorseful of his previous actions, but is still unable to control the disease within, leading to another, more straightforward boss battle. With his final breaths, he pleads you to stop the cultist, who intends to fuse with an ancient being of destruction that has been sleeping in the mountain for millions of years. However, even when dead, the infection still causes the plant part of him to attack Laura again, leading to yet another vision with the Great Mother, which at this point just feels like repetition of the same plot point, as we're not gaining much new information from each of the subsequent visions. We do see the yellow light of creation saving Laura once more, and just like the players have gotten used to this very literal divine intervention, so have the characters in the game.
You again. Scared the hell out of me.
There are even more interpersonal hijinks, which include Parker almost accidentally blowing up Kimberly with a first time bomb, and more tension between the two who seem to have some mutual attraction, but both of them have their personal demons which prevent them from engaging in a healthy relationship. As they finally resolve some of their personal hang-ups, things get even worse, as Parker reveals he's been infected, and while it hasn't taken him over yet, he leaves the party to keep them safe, while deciding to sacrifice himself while opening up the pathway to the final chapter. Returning to the house, Janice returned and seems fearful of Kimberly, while the perfect mother of the piano man morphs into another boss fight, which has a bit more of a special pattern when compared to some of the other bosses in the game. Entering the final disc, we see the cultist enter the red light as Laura and Jenny reach the blown-up gate, where they meet Parker, who's now began to blossom. As he is about to attack the pair, Kimberly appears and gets penetrated by Parker's tentacle, proclaiming her love as she uses her shotgun to bring their lives to a mutual climax. We see yet another vision from the Great Mother, with even more scenes of chaos and death, and also a vision of the cultist inside the void of the red light, beginning to merge with the being. Eventually, Laura and Jenny reach a building which seems to be a laboratory named after Laura's mother, and we finally hear the first actual words said by Laura.
This is Laura. Laura Parton.
The automated security systems only let Laura in, and within we receive some information about her mother, who was a scientist working on the human genome and cloning technology. Deep within the complex, Laura finds a supercomputer which has been created to mimic the consciousness of Lucy Parton, who explains even more about Laura's existence. One of Lucy's goals was to try and clone mammoths from a well-preserved specimen found encased in ice, but this was unsuccessful. Instead, despite mammoths being presumably herbivores, they also found a winged human-like being inside of the mammoth's stomach. Lucy decided to use the DNA of this winged being to impregnate herself, which was the conception of Laura. Being a creature of the past and the present, Laura is confirmed to be the prophesied warrior, as if the visions from the god herself weren't enough to confirm that. Lucy then asks Laura to destroy all of the failed clone experiments, and also the computer that houses her, which works in a similar way as any other boss battle. Except there's no danger, and you have the constant pleas of Lucy in your ears. As Laura ends up in a certain death situation once more, we see one more vision from the Great Mother, where she now says that the evil force has been reborn and is aware of Laura's existence, as we're shown the most recent examples of chaos and destruction in the form of nuclear explosions. Now Laura wakes up in an unfamiliar cabin with an ominous red light seeping in through the window. Seeing that Janny as well has been transported here by the Great Mother. She as well seems to have had another vision from the Great Mother who'd given Janny a message about how the most important thing is time, as she talks about all of the images she saw, mirroring everything the players had seen so far. Suddenly the ground shakes and the red light from the mountain intensifies. Janny screams in horror as some kind of a force seems to attack her.
Laura, I think I'm getting sick. Laura, I can't talk. Laura, I'm scared. Please, Laura. I'm scared. Laura, I'm so scared. I can't see anything. I can't hear anymore. Laura, I'm scared. Please, Laura.
The next part of the game is what could be called a final gauntlet, as the player has to take a long trek through a linear mountain passage toward the red light at the peak, while fighting the most dangerous enemies encountered so far. While there are no means to hunt in the final chapter, that doesn't mean the player can get soft-locked by having no resources, as the starting cabin includes a bed that can be used to replenish all health, the enemies give a hefty amount of experience that can be used to level up, and most importantly, the yard of the cabin has several pieces of equipment which respawn every time the player enters the cabin, including grenades, which can be used to insta-kill all regular enemies, even at this point in the game. Finally, you enter the butthole of the mountain and see one more vision from the Great Mother, whose lines finally change, but aren't much less cryptic than they've been so far.
And Laura, know the planet you inhabit. Know the time you move through it. Awaken the memories that sleep within you. Laura, you must know and feel everything.
After some reassuring words from the past David, we enter a strange void, where the cultist has now merged with the Great Buttplug, that very clearly iterates its purpose of destroying any and all dominant species that develop too far, as a kind of reset button for the cycle of life and death. The battle against the final destroyer shouldn't be particularly difficult, especially if the player took advantage of the very generous respawning items mechanic, but the difficulty doesn't even seem to be the point, as after certain damage thresholds, the final destroyer begins to directly interfere with Laura's abilities. First, the destroyer takes away Laura's ability to see, which in part explains why the battle mechanics are somewhat simplistic, since it would be a bit difficult to shoot the creature while the screen is completely black, with only the user interface visible. Next, Laura's hearing is taken away, which obviously completely mutes the game audio, and now there are very few indications that anything is actually happening. Finally, the destroyer takes away Laura's ability to move, preventing the player from shooting at all and reducing hit points to 1, which can be healed despite Laura being technically dead at this point. After a while, Laura remembers the words of David, who reassures her, confident in her ability to persevere. On his deathbed, David gave Laura a flower he had as a keepsake, stored now inside her compact, as something to remember him by. Using the flower completely reverses what the final destroyer had done to Laura, restoring her hearing, vision, and most importantly, the ability to shoot a giant monster butt plug with a shotgun. After having been basically wiped out by the death of the final destroyer, Laura finds herself in another void, being addressed by the Great Mother, who explains that as a servant of what amounts to God, and basically a half an angel, Laura has powers and capabilities she doesn't yet understand, but must now harness them to embark on an even greater journey as a reward from the Great Mother. But to do so, she has to reach into her memories for some very specific emotions.
David.
As she does so, time reverses, and she finds herself in a bookstore at the tail end of 1999. This little epilogue shows us that the death of the final destroyer allowed Laura to not only reverse time, but also to change some things for the better. The meteors will never fall, and Kimberly is now a published author, even if she is yet to gain universal acclaim. She also meets David, who feels like they have some kind of a connection despite them never having met before. He enjoys the poems of Kimberly, especially one titled Light, which talks about Kimberly's imaginary best friend, whom David feels like makes him think of Laura. We hear that Kimberly's recent poetry has been more positive and full of life, instead of the doomy and gloomy style she was writing at the beginning of the game. As the year changes and the Y2K bug fails to actually manifest, Laura calls to David and embraces him, something which at this point must not be confusing at all for him. D2 is a trip. It's one of those games that is not the easiest one to explain, which in some ways is a good thing, because it gives room for a lot of interpretation and as a result potential for discussion. Though unfortunately there are some aspects which impeded its potential for popularity, so much of that discussion never really materialized in any meaningful way. One of those aspects is the gameplay, which is honestly the worst part of D2. That's not a particularly good thing considering it's supposed to be a game. The adventure gaming style segments work well enough and could be interesting, but are used relatively sparingly, and there's pretty little in terms of gameplay present in those sequences. Most of the puzzles are extremely simplistic and require little to no thought from the player, since as long as they have the appropriate item, the game automatically transitions to the correct action when interacting with an object that can be manipulated in some way. This system could have been used to make a more involved adventure game, but now it's very much half-baked, probably as a result of D2 not being just an adventure game, but instead having a free-roam action game bolted onto the adventure gaming system. The free roam has some similar issues as well, since most of the areas are very empty, and there's not much to do other than walk from one point of interest to another. While this has its purpose in creating a sense of loneliness, it does take a lot of time, and the potential of players to ponder the storyline during these segments is impeded by the addition of the most out-of-place portion of D2, which is the combat, where the tone seems to completely shift, and the gameplay routes the player into place where they must wail at the enemies with weapons, most of which have infinite ammunition, meaning there's not even a survival element attached. It makes sense that that's lacking, since unlike traditional survival horror games, D2 relies on a random encounter system, and there's no option to run away or avoid the enemies, so the player needed to have a means of actually progressing through the somewhat frequent encounters. As a totality, the combination of gameplay elements has potential, but unfortunately all of the segments feel a bit half-baked, and all of them quickly become repetitive and not the most interesting. When it comes to audiovisual design, that's where D2 succeeds much better. For its time, D2 is really good looking, and the facial animations of the characters are leagues ahead of most games released around the same time. Similarly, the soundscape of everything but the combat segments have been built masterfully, and the soundtrack does a great job at creating a vision of a very melancholic experience. Then we get to the absolutely best part, which is the storyline. At its core, it's not particularly groundbreaking. You play as what amounts to the Chosen One, having to battle against an ancient evil that's mutating humanity into monstrosities, and to undo the damage done, the evil being has to be destroyed. But that's not all, and in some ways D2 even subverts some of the classic tropes, sometimes by purposefully leaning onto said tropes so hard that it can come off as pretty silly. For example, often the main character of games is inexplicably what amounts to as the Chosen One, who just survives dangerous situations by the virtue of being the main character. In D2, Laura's literally a servant of God, who was created from the cells of an angel, and she ends up in certain death situations multiple times, only to be unambiguously rescued by the divine force. This happens so many times that even the characters get kind of annoyed at it.
Almost gave me a heart attack. Let me guess. The yellow light again.
It's actually pretty brilliant in my opinion. Then we get to Kimberly, who's an extremely damaged individual with a lot of pain in her past, who's numbing said pain by taking the drug Linda while hand-waving away the potential side effects that she alludes to at one point. The side effects are actually a somewhat important point of the story, which culminates at the very end, even if it's not explicitly explained. From the tentacle scene at the beginning, the mutant creatures manage to obtain Kimberly's DNA, creating lookalikes of her. We also see someone who looks like her killing someone and trapping Laura in the cold storage with the intention to kill her too. The assumption could be that this is the work of the clones, but I don't think so. It's actually Kimberly doing these things. One reason why I think so is Jenny, who seems to allude that it was indeed the same Kimberly she spent time with, who at one point later in the game went berserk and tried to chase after her too. But it's also about the end result of deaths of several characters. Whenever the mutant Kimberly kills, the corpse ends up being severely mutilated with body parts going missing as the mutant consumes them. However, multiple characters linked to Kimberly end up just dying, and while severely beaten up, nothing of them was consumed, therefore leading me to believe that Kimberly is the one who ended up killing people like the Stone Hut Man, the pianist and the priest, all in a drug-fueled haze similar to which the crazed scientist had during his hunt for Kimberly. Most of the story is told by using relatively long and slow cutscenes, which take their time to really soak in the atmosphere, and it seems to be on purpose that some things are left unexplained. Though there are also instances where things are mentioned, but then they amount to absolutely nothing. For example, the mention of cold and not being able to survive in it for long is made to seem like an important thing at least twice during the cutscenes. But that has zero relevance to the gameplay or the storyline in those segments where attention is brought to this idea. Perhaps there was meant to be some kind of a warmth mechanic at some point which didn't end up being in the final game. That might explain it. Overall, while the storyline is in a sense about two divine entities battling each other, with one creating life and the other one destroying it, most of the story being told actually focuses more on the relationships between the characters and their mental struggles. Laura is for the most of the game an amnesiac, receiving visions from the Great Mother while also slowly recovering some of her memories, specifically those involving David, with whom she seemed to form a close relationship with during their week together after the crash. Kimberly has a tragic past which has caused her to be extremely distrustful of men and having a very negative outlook of life in general, while Parker is so consumed with his obsession about extraterrestrial life that it's severely impeding his ability to take other people's feelings and wants into account appropriately. Laura's memories and emotions end up playing a very important part in the main storyline as well, as it's heavily implied that the reason Laura was able to break free from the clutches of the final destroyer is because of the connection she formed with David, in essence showing how the power of love conquers all, and in the end transcends time itself. Kimberly and Parker both seem to resolve some of their issues, with both of them ending up sacrificing themselves for the sake of others they care about. These lessons that the characters learned during gameplay seem to be transferred into their past selves as some kind of a genetic memory type thing, as that's also a concept brought up at one point, and the new iterations of their past selves seem to have found means to move on in more healthy ways with their lives in the timeline created after the destruction of the evil entity. D2's story seems to very much be about conquering our fears and learning how to care about other people, more than it's about the deadly infection, which, while somewhat explained as a thing manifested by the final destroyer, doesn't really matter for the most of the storyline. At the beginning, there's another one of those aspects that gets very little attention, as Parker explains about the mimicking nature of the infection, making it seem like there's this whole The Thing style who's infected, who's not threat, but that too has very little screen time in the overall plot. One of the potential explanations for the focus on conquering our fears and learning to get over those fears with the power of love in the face of an invisible deadly force is given to us at the end of the game, where we're shown multiple factoids about the world in 1999, including the state of HIV infections around the world in multiple slides. D2 might be a somewhat curious allegory to the HIV scare, and while I can't say it for sure, hear me out. There's a hidden infection which doesn't outwardly show itself until it's too late, and you never know who's infected or not. The infection's very deadly, though there's uncertainty about whether someone could live a completely normal life after being infected, or whether the infection can be cured. There are people extremely afraid of even the concept of the infection, but once it hits someone they care about, their opinion can change and they become more concerned about treating the infected instead of merely driving them away. The infection is not an inherent part of the person and is in fact something that can harm others without the person wanting it to. There's a lot of very sexual imagery, starting from many of the infected mutants being basically just phalluses that pop up from the snow, and since it's a Japanese game, there are obviously a massive amount of tentacles. For those thinking they're not inherently sexual, sure, you're correct, but in the very first cutscene of the game, D2 makes it very clear that in this instance, they absolutely are. Then there's the most unfortunate character design, especially considering what they're constantly talking about during the boss fight, in the shape of Janny's grandpa, whose design was, understandably, changed for the non-Japanese release, as the original design was even more suggestive, as the tentacle's position was very different, and in the original orientation, a large, protruding tentacle shooting white goo at you was, not exactly subtle. Then there's Laura's mother, who's now an AI entity inside a machine, whose only purpose is to try and birth a batch of clones of the ancient angel found inside the mammoth, and the shape of the supercomputer? Well, look at it. Seriously. There's little to no subtlety in the sexual imagery. Even the end of Kimberly and Parker in the Doom timeline is bashing the player on the head with it, as she gets penetrated by Parker's tentacle, despite her knowing it would likely kill her, as she wants to face the end together with the person she's now fallen in love with. There are so many little details in D2. Even Janny's strange death isn't just a silly and weird animation, it's foreshadowing to what the final destroyer is going to do to Kimberly during the final battle, as Janny's senses disappear in the same order as Laura's do, so we can assume that before remembering the love for David, Kimberly was just a formless puddle in the void. Then there's the drug Linda, which gets a lot of screen time but relatively little direct explanation. It seems to be marketed as some kind of remedy for all mental ailments, but seems to mostly just dull the senses of the people using it, and causing some of them to get violent with cannibalistic urges. The drug is made from a flower that only grows on the mountain where the final destroyer resides, and the only field of these flowers we see is on the final trek towards the red seed in the mountain. This makes me believe there's a link and the flowers are a product of this entity, perhaps a weaker form of the infection that begins making people into monsters after the being awakens. That would also explain why a mammoth would have consumed an angel whole, as it could have eaten the flowers and gotten the same carnivorous urges Linda seems to trigger in people. There's also how only 2 of the people in our main group explicitly sees visions from the Great Mother, and the 2 that don't, one of them is using Linda and the other one is infected, which could mean they've lost connection with the Great Mother as a result of now being under the influence of the final destroyer instead. Overall, would I recommend D2? As a game, absolutely not. It's painfully mediocre, and someone wanting for an entertaining video game, it can be boring, meandering, and can overstay its welcome at multiple points, especially at the beginning. As an experience, for someone who enjoys slow and melancholic atmosphere with a lot of focus on the state of human existence and the terrors inherent in that existence even without literal monsters, absolutely I would recommend it. But that is it for this time. And I'd like to thank all of the Ko-fi, Patreon, Steady, and YouTube supporters: Daniel Heinevetter, Highwood Court, Iliad Drone, Daniel Zupka, Kyriakos, Nazgul Senpai, R. Theron, The Chronozoan, Ville Oyala, Zai, Andrew Yanke, Masaz, The Rain Dog, Banin, and Professor Fessa. This ended up being way longer than I expected. What I didn't know was how strange of an existential experience D2 would be, but now I've found an appreciation for it in a similar way I have an appreciation for Deadly Premonition. Both of them have this very clear vision, which sometimes works well, but it's also sometimes pretty funny because the execution isn't the best, and from a gameplay perspective, many of the aspects of both games come off as very raw and unpolished. I'll try to pick something a little bit less heavy next time, since while I absolutely loved D2 for its strangeness and sometimes less than subtle imagery, the focus on psychological issues like depression was perhaps not the best idea for me to look at during this season. I also want to reiterate how much I appreciate the continuing support for this project. I've been able to play so many games I otherwise wouldn't have, and it's been an absolute trip. Even on the streams, I absolutely wouldn't have played either of the Llama Liner games on my own, and now I've fallen in love with those as well. Perhaps I need to make videos out of them too, once I've finished the second one, but that's for the future. For now, if I don't have the time and energy to make one video for December, I'd like to wish everyone a good end of the year, and strength to endure the seasonal maladies that are somewhat common. You can do it. But, until next time, Fintrovert, signing out.